Vegas Bray was young, attractive, and ambitious.
She was determined to make something of herself.
She was very proud of the way she looked.
And she thought she'd found love with a fellow Navy veteran, Victor Salcedo.
They were a pretty serious couple.
Their friends were thrilled.
I was like, that's cool. He's found somebody.
I'm like, okay, this guy could be the one for her.
Sadly, it wasn't to be.
He's not breathing, he's not moving.
But what had caused Victor's tragic death? It was up to police to untangle the mystery.
It might have been a suicide.
Or was something much more sinister to blame?
Fatal attraction was what they were calling it.
She snapped.
Imperial Beach, California, October 16, 2012. It was a sunny Tuesday in this beach town tucked between Tijuana and San Diego.
Imperial Beach is kind of a jewel of San Diego. There's some really beautiful beachfront along there and a big, beautiful pier.
But the jewel isn't entirely flawless.
It also has a side where there's kind of a lot of drugs.
It's close to the Mexican border, so there was, on occasion, alien traffic through there, some drug involvement.
And at 3:30 that afternoon, San Diego County Dispatch received an urgent 911 call.
This is 911, how can I help you?
Oh my God, I need help.
The caller, 24-year-old Vegas Bray, told the dispatcher she'd just found 31-year-old Victor Salcedo sprawled on the floor of his Imperial Beach apartment in a pool of blood.
Please, send someone, please help me.
It was a very emotional call that she made.
He's not breathing, he's not moving, he's so still. Oh my God.
She thinks Victor is dead.
What happened? Was he shot, stabbed? What happened?
Shot.
Do you know who did this?
I don't know.
However, Vegas did tell the operator that there was a gun lying on the floor next to Victor.
Okay. Do you know if that gun that's laying by him is his?
It is.
It kind of sounded like it might have been a suicide.
Whatever the cause, deputies from the San Diego County Sheriff's Department raced to the scene.
It was a quiet, nice apartment complex overlooking the Pacific Ocean.
When the authorities arrived, what started out as a suicide would morph into something far more complex. A twisted tale of sex, obsession, and just maybe, murder. Born in 1988, Vegas Bray had grown up in San Diego.
She's from City Heights. It's not the poorest neighborhood, but it's not, the best one either.
Her home life wasn't necessarily the best either.
She had a very difficult time growing up.
And as a child, she didn't even know who her father was.
She never talked about a dad. She was very private about stuff like that.
But if life at home was hard, things were better at school.
She had a lot of friends. She had a lot of girlfriends.
She made good grades.
She worked her butt off. She was determined to get out of there and make something of herself.
And as one of the popular girls at Hoover High School, she made sure she looked the part.
She definitely was someone who took care of her looks. She was very proud of the way she looked.
She won Best Smile in the yearbook our senior year.
To go with her winning smile, Vegas had a reputation for being nice.
She would even cuss. She would say stuff like, dang it. We would make fun of her for that. And that's what I remember her being just this good girl.
She also found a practical way to cash in on her popularity.
Guys liking their hair done, and they would pay her money and she'd braid their hair. I thought she was going to get into that kind of business, work for a salon.
But after graduating high school in 2007, Vegas went in a different direction. Like many teens in a town with a big military presence, she chose to enlist. And she went to work in the machine shop at San Diego's massive naval base, home port of the Pacific Fleet.
It's a large naval installation. Aircraft carriers, destroyers are docked there.
It's also the home port for thousands of sailors, including a handsome young man named Victor Salcedo. 7 years older than Vegas, Victor wasn't a San Diego native.
He joined the military, came out here to San Diego.
In the Navy, he served on a destroyer based out of San Diego.
He was a damage controlman. So basically, if something were broke or there was a fire or say a ship got hit by a missile or anything like that, he was basically the first responder on board the ship.
To unwind when he wasn't at sea, Victor shared a San Diego bachelor pad with some of his Navy buddies.
We just basically did what most single guys do in their 20s.
And that included entertaining a parade of young women.
Victor dated a lot of people. It was hard for somebody to keep his attention for too long.
But Victor's string of girlfriends didn't include Vegas Bray. While they did know each other from base, they never dated while in the service.
They knew each other and were friends. There wasn't any type of intimate relationship or a romantic relationship.
Victor left the Navy in 2012, mostly to spend time with his 4-year-old son.
He had a son with a girlfriend, a former girlfriend.
Right after they separated, he found out she was pregnant, and there was really no bad blood between them. They stayed friends.
Definitely wanted to be in his son's life, wanted to raise him, and wanted to provide for him.
And to better provide for his son, Victor started taking classes at a local college.
He wanted to go into law enforcement.
He was really intent on getting a good job, a solid job where he could provide for his son.
While Victor left the Navy to be closer to his little boy, his friend Vegas got out for a different reason. She realized that the military life just wasn't her style.
She wasn't happy in the Navy. I know she didn't like it.
She was basically not adjusting to the military lifestyle, the structure, the regimen, the rules. She did have a difficult time in the Navy.
And in 2010, she had applied for and received an early discharge.
It was administrative, not a punitive measure.
Out of the Navy, Vegas was free from the restrictions of the military lifestyle, but she still struggled to readjust to civilian life.
She was depressed. She wasn't happy with herself.
Looking to leave her machinist work behind, but with little experience in anything else, Vegas took a job as a waitress at a strip club.
She was an attractive woman.
She had a voluptuous body, I would say. She's kind of curvy.
And to keep that curvy shape, Vegas regularly hit the gym, which is where she reconnected with her friend from the Navy, Victor Salcedo.
He liked to work out and she liked to work out. And I think that's what kind of brought them together.
And by March of 2011, after nearly a year of working out together, Vegas and Victor became more than friends.
The thing that attracted him to her was Victor had like a sarcastic kind of humor. She had that same kind of sarcastic humor.
Once they started dating, it was obvious that Vegas and Victor went well together.
She was outgoing, attractive, and friendly, somebody who he enjoyed spending time with.
They were a pretty serious couple, actually. You know, they did couples dates, they stayed at each other's houses, they were close, really close.
She spent a lot of time with him. They spent a lot of time together.
Victor's friends were happy about his new relationship.
She seemed like a cool chick, so I was like, that's cool. He's found somebody he can just relax with.
And Vegas, her friends weren't just happy, they were hopeful.
They were always together, so I'm like, okay, this guy could be the one for her.
But it wasn't to be. A little more than a year after they officially started dating, Vegas would place a frantic phone call to 911 and report finding Victor on the floor, covered in blood. Coming up, could Victor's death be a suicide?
A .38 caliber revolver is a very deadly weapon.
And could Vegas shed any light on the situation?
I don't know what happened.
On October 16, 2012, 24-year-old Vegas Bray called 911 in Imperial Beach, California. Through tears, she reported finding 31-year-old Victor Salcedo lying on the floor of his apartment, surrounded by a pool of blood.
What happened? Was he shot, stabbed? What happened?
Shot. Miss, I don't know. I'm not sure what happened.
Although, since Vegas did say there was a gun lying on the floor beside Victor, the implications seem obvious.
She told him that he had shot himself, but it was a suicide.
But was it a suicide? When the sheriff's deputies and EMTs arrived on the scene, they found Victor as Vegas had described him.
He was found basically in the hallway just outside his bathroom.
And just as Vegas had feared, he was dead. There was a handgun lying at his side, which investigators assumed was the weapon that killed him.
A .38 caliber revolver is a very deadly weapon.
However, while that much appeared to coincide with what Vegas had told the 911 dispatcher, there was one surprise waiting at the scene for the first responders.
There were multiple shots.
In fact, Victor's body was covered in gunshot wounds.
Very obviously serious wounds to his face, his head, his upper body.
Several of those shots are going to have been fatal.
Which made one thing very clear to the deputies at the scene.
With the number of times he was shot, it wouldn't be possible for suicide under those circumstances.
The number of shots wasn't the only problem with the suicide scenario either. In addition to the wounds to his head and torso, Victor had also been shot in the hand.
Consistent with him holding up his hand, kind of a defensive way to avoid being shot.
Which led the deputies at the scene to an immediate conclusion.
They would quickly deduce that it was a homicide.
A quick canvass of the apartment complex appeared to confirm the assessment.
There were several people that heard the gunshots.
Up to 10 shots is what witnesses are saying.
They heard 5 to 6 gunshots, then silence, and then 4 more gunshots.
In other words, Victor's killer had stopped to reload.
A .38 caliber revolver only holds 6 bullets.
And every one of those bullets was meant to do deadly damage, as evidenced by the box of ammunition the killer left behind.
They used hollow point ammunition, which causes more damage to the human body than a standard type of ammunition would.
But who had been so determined to make sure Victor Salcedo was dead? At the scene, Vegas was the only witness, but she had little additional information to give the investigators.
She didn't know what happened.
But she was more than willing to talk. Vegas was transported to the San Diego County Sheriff's Department in Imperial Beach to give her statement.
Vegas Bray was taken voluntarily to the sheriff's substation.
Okay, Vegas, just here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get some background information.
Starting with how she knew Victor and what she was doing at his house that day.
You're in the Navy and you guys run into each other on base and you just become friends.
Yeah.
Intimate or not intimate?
No, we were just friends for years.
But once they both left the Navy, they reconnected.
We were dating like off and on for years.
They were a pretty serious couple. She thought that they were in love.
Life is good, I assume?
Yeah.
But then, Vegas said their relationship took an unexpected turn.
He broke up with me.
And according to Vegas, he didn't even have the decency to do it in person.
He deleted me as a friend, like he unfriended me on Facebook. And he didn't even, none of this was in person or anything. He just stopped.
Oh, he broke up with you not in person?
Yeah, it was like over the phone and then through Facebook. And then I drove over there to see him because I was like, what the hell?
It was an ugly breakup, but it had happened in December, more than 10 months before Victor's death. And according to Vegas, the breakup wasn't quite the end of their sexual relationship.
They kept like a late night relationship from time to time, but, that's how Victor was.
They had continued to hook up off and on through the early part of the year, and Vegas said that gave her hope that their relationship could be saved.
We spent that night together. So I thought we were okay. I thought maybe we could get back together.
But after a few weeks, It became clear that wasn't the case.
It wasn't until March where he said he just doesn't want a relationship, period.
Feel like he was using you?
Oh, yeah.
And in March of 2012, when even their late-night hookups stopped, Vegas had gone back to Victor's place again, just not for a face-to-face confrontation.
She went and threw eggs at his car.
And that wasn't all she admitted doing.
I punctured some of his tires. I punctured two. Or then, I think in March I punctured one. And then I punctured another. And then I did two.
Victor, apparently anxious to end the egg throwing and tire slashing, had tried to calm things down.
He's like, let's be friends and leave it at that, even after she did all this stuff.
And according to Vegas, just a week earlier, when she'd announced that she was going to move into the same Imperial Beach apartment complex where Victor lived, he'd offered to co-sign her lease.
Did you believe him?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like he was finally feeling guilty or something.
And the night before, when she dropped by Victor's apartment to talk about his offer, it appeared that he was more than willing to let bygones be bygones.
He offered me a drink and we just started drinking.
They didn't stop at drinking, though.
Victor Salcedo and Vegas Bray had spent the night together. You still had feelings for him?
Yeah.
Just weren't ready to let go of that guy, were you?
I wanted to, but it's hard.
And according to Vegas, things got even tougher the next morning.
Once they got out, Vegas Bray wanted to go out to breakfast.
He said, no, like, you're gonna f me, but you don't want to eat with me.
And Vegas claimed she'd left the apartment soon after.
You didn't get in an argument about it?
No.
Okay.
You left and you were happy to be leaving.
I still didn't see why he didn't want to go eat, but I was like, okay.
But if Vegas had left the apartment that morning, why was she there at 3:30 in the afternoon? That's where Vegas's story started becoming a little vague. According to Vegas, she didn't plan on going over to Victor's that afternoon.
She had plans that day to meet with a mutual friend.
But somehow, while on the 5 freeway, headed to her friend's house, Vegas turned around.
She ended up going back to Victor Salcedo's apartment.
But when asked what happened after she arrived, Vegas couldn't say.
I don't know what happened.
She says that she didn't remember.
I blacked out.
And when she came to, she saw Victor.
That's when I was there at Vic's. He was bloody.
The gun was on the floor next to Victor's body.
My ears are ringing.
But if her ears were ringing, did that mean Vegas had shot him? Or merely that she'd witnessed the shooting? Coming up, why doesn't Vegas remember the shooting?
It's not the first time I blacked out.
Or had she forgotten to share a key fact with investigators?
He's like, I'm trying to leave this girl and she won't let me.
On the afternoon of October 16, 2012, Vegas Bray called 911 and reported finding her ex-boyfriend Victor Salcedo lying dead in his Imperial Beach, California apartment.
Victor was shot 9 times, multiple shots to his face, his head, his upper body.
Brought in for questioning, the 24-year-old cocktail waitress had essentially admitted to being in the apartment when Victor was shot.
He's bloody, and you're standing there, and you don't remember any words, nothing.
My ears are ringing.
Her statement was basically that she didn't know what happened.
I blacked out.
And that wasn't all that Vegas told the investigators either.
It's not the first time I blacked out.
According to Vegas, her blackouts had started long before she ever met Victor.
She had a troubled childhood, and events that took place in her life traumatized her and led to mental health issues.
I've been sexually abused since I can remember.
If a person is a victim of either a sexual assault or abuse throughout their life, it's definitely going to have a mental effect on them.
Police pressed her for more information.
Did you ever report any of that to the police?
When I did, I was 12. I reported it to a teacher, and my mom, she didn't believe me.
The story was heartbreaking, but detectives were a little skeptical.
I've had people in other cases say that they blacked out, never had any real evidence to back that up. They're not taking responsibility for what they did.
But was that true in Vegas's case?
Have you ever went to a doctor for this condition?
I had to see a psych.
Vegas said that the psychiatrist had diagnosed her with several issues.
I have depression, and I was supposed to work on that with the psych, and now I just have the disability, PTSD.
Her emotional issues might explain her memory loss, but investigators wondered if they could also explain Victor's death.
Do you think they had an effect on what occurred today?
I'm scared.
And according to Vegas, she had reason to be.
It was my gun. That's my gun.
It was a stunning admission, the complete opposite of what she'd initially said during her 911 call.
Okay. Do you know if that gun that's laying by him is his?
It is.
And it made the investigators' next question obvious.
Do you think it's unfair for me to believe that you killed Victor?
It does make sense. But I wouldn't.
Not that Vegas's denials made any difference to the investigators.
She was placed under arrest.
It wasn't so much as a whodunit because we had a pretty good idea of what happened. So what we wanted to try and do was to figure out why.
The next day, after Vegas was booked into jail on murder charges, the investigators began conducting follow-up interviews with Victor and Vegas's friends.
I think everybody in their circle, in their social circle, kind of knew that she was a little unstable.
But was Vegas an emotionally disturbed woman who blacked out under stress? No one had ever witnessed any blackouts like the one Vegas described, although most agreed that she had a quick temper.
You could tell something wasn't right.
She would fly off the handle at anything.
According to most friends, it was usually jealousy that would set Vegas off.
Bray would get jealous about him talking on Facebook to other girls.
And there was one woman in particular that Vegas objected to.
There was a growing amount of jealousy that came out on the part of Vegas Bray over him wanting to spend time with the mother of his son.
One time we were having a barbecue at a friend's house. His son's mother called him and she went off on him for that.
She would make a scene in front of their friends.
And in private, according to what Victor told his friend Jeremiah Messenger, Vegas went from making scenes to making threats.
He told me that he woke up one time in the morning, she had stayed the night, and she was sitting on his chest with the gun in his face.
Not long after that, Victor had broken up with her.
He didn't want to be involved in all the drama.
However, according to Victor's closest friends, telling Vegas it was over had only heightened the drama.
She would text him constantly, rageful texts that included threats that were really quite alarming, direct threats that she was going to harm him in some way.
Vegas's threats had Victor on edge too.
And he's just like, oh man, I'm just stressed out. And I'm like, well, what's going on? And he's like, trying to leave this girl and she won't let me.
She was stalking him. She was following him place he went.
She was outside of his apartment one time just sitting there staring, and neighbors saw her just sitting there staring at his house.
But was Vegas just a jilted lover acting out? Or was it something more?
I think anyone who's been through a bad breakup in a serious relationship can relate on some level. For a while, that other person is all you think about. You go through sort of a grieving process. I think for Vegas, it never ended, it just intensified.
And as Vegas had already admitted to the police, her grief had eventually turned to anger.
He would go shopping at the mall, come out and his car would be keyed.
That's punishment. How dare you? How dare you?
She was obsessed, crazy.
But at the time, Victor had no actual proof that it was Vegas who'd been vandalizing his car.
There was no witnesses or anyone that could tie her to that.
And Victor feared he wouldn't be taken seriously anyway.
You got a big 6'1" guy scared of a little 5'2" girl.
Despite that, Victor had eventually become so concerned with Vegas's behavior that he'd gone to the authorities.
We went down to the sheriffs, talked to them, and they kind of turned their nose up at him.
The way the laws are structured, police are reactive. Very hard to be proactive.
And the one time Victor did catch her in the act,
He actually chased her down in the car after a bottle came through his window.
once he called police and they came out and spoke to Vegas, Victor had a change of heart and declined to press any charges.
He didn't necessarily want to get her in trouble or create a violent confrontation.
I think he was hoping more that just the warning alone would, pretty much interrupt everything.
But the warning didn't work.
He told me that she was still doing the same things.
She just couldn't get Victor out of her mind.
And Victor became desperate.
He was clearly concerned. He would park in a different spot. He borrowed somebody else's car to try and avoid a confrontation.
He even moved into a different unit in his apartment complex and contemplated moving home to Chicago.
The only reason he stayed was he couldn't be away from his son.
Shifting apartments wasn't enough to throw Vegas off his trail, though. Friends said that she'd eventually found him, and when she announced her intention to move into the same complex.
He did co-sign on a lease for her.
According to friends, Victor felt he had no other choice.
Towards the end, he was scared. And I think he's like, well, all I can do is try and be cool with her and hope she calms down.
Although by then, according to his friend Jeremiah, Victor had all but given up hope.
The last time I saw Victor, he told me that he had that feeling that she was going to kill him.
After all, Vegas had made it clear how she felt.
She told him straight out, if I can't have you, nobody will.
But if Victor was so afraid of Vegas, why did he invite her in for a drink on October 15th and then spend the entire night with her?
It's like literally throwing gasoline on a fire. It just makes it burn even hotter.
To the investigators and prosecutors, it looked like an obvious case of premeditated murder.
There was never any other suspects.
But the prosecution's airtight case was about to blow up. It happened 6 months after her arrest on April 24, 2013, when Vegas was in court for a preliminary hearing.
A witness was testifying, and she was describing how jealous Vegas is.
For whatever reason, that resulted in an outburst from Vegas Bray.
She was screaming, "I'm not jealous. I was never jealous."
And she continued screaming despite the best efforts of her attorney.
The lawyer was trying to quiet her, trying to get her to stop because that's very harmful to her as a defendant.
Vegas wouldn't stop screaming, though, and eventually the judge called for the bailiffs.
She had to be escorted out of the courtroom.
After Vegas's outburst, her attorney requested a psychological evaluation, and the judge granted it.
To make sure that Vegas Bray was confident to stand trial.
And in July of 2013, after 3 months of sessions with a psychologist, they reached a conclusion.
She was determined to be not fit for trial at that time.
The judge ordered her transferred from the jail to a treatment facility.
Some mental health issues had to be worked through.
And if they weren't, she might never face a jury. Coming up, can Vegas's defense prove she didn't know what she was doing?
Are you talking about a second personality?
Or will the prosecution produce evidence of a plan?
Fatal attraction was what they were calling.
It wasn't until October 15th, 2015, that 27-year-old Vegas Bray finally went on trial in a San Diego County courtroom.
It took us 3 years to get to trial.
She was charged with the October 16th, 2012 murder of her ex-boyfriend, 31-year-old Victor Salcedo.
She was arrested within a day and ultimately incarcerated until her trial.
And she'd spent most of that time in a mental health facility.
Criminal proceedings are suspended and additional exams are done until the court is satisfied that she is legally competent.
And finally, after 3 years of psych evaluation and legal maneuvering, she was cleared to proceed.
She was then deemed to be psychologically fit to handle a trial.
When the trial began that morning, the courtroom was packed with Vegas's family, Victor's friends, and the media.
This case had a lot of interest in the media because of the jealousy and the rage and the fact that the person was stalked and then ultimately lost their life as a result of it.
That's exactly how the prosecutor laid it out in his opening statement, starting with how Vegas had stalked Victor for months after their breakup.
Slashing the tires on his car, putting paint on his front door.
She was obsessed with the boy, and I don't know what it was about him.
She could not let it go.
And according to the prosecution, she eventually realized she couldn't get him back.
She shot him 9 times.
It was really the ultimate act of obsession.
Fatal attraction was what they were calling it.
In its open, the defense didn't deny that Vegas had shot Victor.
She called 911 herself to report that he was dead. So she definitely wasn't trying to run from this or hide from it.
However, the defense also stood by Vegas's initial claim that she had no memory of the shooting.
The defense was basically saying, look, due to a mental illness, she was not conscious of what she was doing.
And because Vegas wasn't aware of her actions, there was no intent to kill.
In the state of California, if somebody is not legally conscious at the time that they act, they cannot be held criminally liable.
Could the prosecutors prove that Vegas had gone over to Victor's, planning to kill him? When they started laying out their case, one of the pieces of evidence they turned to were Vegas's own words, her posts on social media.
The things that she wrote on her computer should have been some kind of a warning to the people around her. It goes to show her state of mind and the fact that she was so angry.
But also the private notes that Vegas had written.
On her laptop computer, there were files that talked about how much she hated Victor Salcedo.
People, when they write that kind of stuff, it's like they want to leave that legacy behind that, you know, they were trying to project that anger and they want somebody to know about it after it takes place.
Then, to prove that Victor's murder had been premeditated, the prosecutors pointed the jury to one thing that Vegas had written.
Entitled by her the bucket list.
And compared to most people, Vegas's bucket list was a little different.
Her bucket list was not to go travel or see great things. It was to find Victor Salcedo, kill him.
However, killing Victor wasn't the last thing Vegas planned to cross off her list.
She was going to kill herself.
And in August, once she'd made her list, Vegas had gone out and bought a .38 caliber revolver.
By going out and buying the weapon, that shows planning.
But if Vegas had a cold-blooded plan for murder, why did she wait approximately 2 months before going through with it?
I think that her intent, maybe subconsciously, was she was going to somehow get him back.
And on the night of October 15th, those subconscious hopes got a huge boost.
The night before she murdered him, they spent the night together.
But the next morning, any thought of reconciliation came to a humiliating end.
He would have sex with her, but he wouldn't even eat with her. That made her upset and embarrassed, ashamed.
That was the switch that triggered her.
She snapped.
And when she did, according to the prosecutors, Vegas had gone home, loaded her gun, and gone back to Victor's.
She just went into his apartment, shot him 6 times.
Then she reloaded the gun.
She shot him a few more times.
This person was filled with anger and rage.
But why hadn't Vegas followed through with the rest of her plan and turned the gun on herself? To answer that question, the prosecutors called Vegas's half-brother to the stand.
It was very difficult for him. He loved his sister, but he wanted to do the right thing.
And according to her brother's testimony, The reason Vegas didn't kill herself, and the reason she did call 911, was because she'd called him first.
The way he described it was basically she was calling to say goodbye.
But was that the only reason she called him?
I'm not sure if she wanted him to talk her down, which ultimately he did.
However, according to the prosecution, deciding not to kill herself had left Vegas with a problem.
It's like, oh my, now look what I've done. I'm alive and I have to answer this thing.
And according to the prosecution, Vegas could think of only one answer.
I'll just say I blacked out.
Was Vegas's blackout claim just an excuse?
Conveniently, you don't remember the most significant moment of your life.
Or was it possible she really had no memory of killing Victor? When it was the defense's turn, they built their case around Vegas's history of mental illness.
She came across as a very troubled young woman who had, I think, some emotional issues that she was struggling to deal with.
They were issues that not only delayed her trial, they were also issues that she had been upfront about with the investigators from the very beginning.
I have depression, and I'm supposed to work on that with the psych.
The defense also claimed that she had long suffered from a post-traumatic stress disorder.
There was a lot of evidence from the defense that she had a very difficult time growing up.
Possible sexual abuse in her early life when she was a child.
Horrible things that would really make a mark on anyone.
And according to the defense and Vegas's own admission, that childhood trauma had left her suicidal.
When I would run down the beach, like I would just think about just going into the ocean, maybe just drowning.
However, according to Vegas, thoughts of suicide weren't her only means of dealing with the stress and trauma of her childhood. She'd also created a sort of alter ego.
It's a comic book character I came up with, like back in middle school. I call her Baby Bray.
Although the more Vegas had talked about Baby Bray, the less she sounded like a comic book character and more like something else.
Shanda does a lot for me. Because, like, I give it to her.
Are we talking about a second personality within you?
And according to Vegas, that's who killed Victor.
I'm just thinking it's another part of me that did it, that it had to be, it had to be her. She did it.
They presented a very detailed argument that she was not legally conscious, not legally aware of what she was doing at the time she killed him.
But while Vegas's friends and supporters believed it,
Vegas, I knew wouldn't have done that. That was somebody else that did that. It was her, just not her that I knew.
would the split personality defense be enough to convince a jury? In his closing argument, the prosecutor did his best to counter the defense's claims.
The facts just didn't fit that defense.
This is not an argument where two people are in the kitchen, one grabs a knife, stabs the other, and goes, oh my gosh, what have I done? It's something that she put a lot of thought into.
She was carrying out a plan that had been made months before.
And when it was finally time to pull the trigger, she did.
To shoot someone 6 times, not a single round missing, and then reloading and firing again, were all very consistent with her being aware of what she was doing.
Coming up, the jury deliberates over Vegas's fate.
They were trying to take into consideration her mental illness.
But will it be enough to set her free?
At the end of the day, does that make it okay to kill somebody?
On November 2nd, 2015, a San Diego jury reached a decision in the murder trial of Vegas Bray.
There were a couple of days of deliberations.
They were trying to take into consideration her mental illness.
The 27-year-old was accused of shooting her ex-boyfriend, Victor Salcedo, 9 times in October of 2012.
She claimed that she didn't remember any of this.
She wasn't there in her head.
It does happen. People do black out and do things when they're conscious that they don't remember later.
But even if that were true,
At the end of the day, does that make it okay to kill somebody?
the jury's answer was unequivocal.
She was guilty of murder in the first degree.
She was responsible for her actions.
And now she was finally going to pay the price.
Hearing that gavel come down and saying guilty, first-degree murder, you know what is going to happen to you.
Under California law, for first-degree murder, the penalty is 25 years to life, and there's an additional consecutive term of 25 years to life if a firearm is used.
At her sentencing hearing on January 8, 2015, Vegas's attorney did make a final plea for leniency.
Due to the severity of this trauma Vegas suffered at a very young age, she developed no resiliency, no coping skills to manage feelings of rejection, abandonment, and loss.
But despite that appeal, the judge said the jury's decision left him with no choice.
They could have reduced this crime to second-degree murder. They could have reduced it to voluntary manslaughter. In fact, they could have reduced it all the way down to involuntary manslaughter.
But they had found Vegas guilty of first-degree murder.
She's sentenced to 50 years to life in prison.
Vegas would spend most of her future in a California prison, a victim of her own deadly obsession.
It often starts out very slight and then ultimately gets worse and worse.
It becomes such a frenzy that the consequences are no longer important to them.
And all because neither she nor anyone around her saw the danger signs until it was too late.
If she had just told someone, it could have ended up very differently.
It was just a lack of communication, and if there was more of it, I think we could have been prevented for sure. I do regret not talking to her more about it. I probably could have, talked her out of it. We, as friends, probably could have talked her out of it.
Or at the very least, found a way to stop her.
They could have gotten her some help, some mental help that she clearly needed. It could have ended up very differently.
On the afternoon of July 29, 1999, Atlanta was moving at the relentless pace that had come to define the late 1990s. Across the city's financial district, computer monitors flickered with constantly changing numbers as investors chased opportunity during one of the most explosive periods in modern American markets. The internet boom had convinced countless ordinary people that fortunes could be made in a single trading session. Inside brokerage offices, phones rang without pause, keyboards clicked in rapid succession, and traders stared at glowing screens where every fraction of a dollar seemed capable of changing a life. It was a world built on speed, confidence, and risk. Few imagined that before the market day was over, those same offices would become scenes of unimaginable violence. Among the people entering one of those buildings that afternoon was a familiar face. Employees had seen him many times before. He had traded there. He knew the layout of the office, the routines of the staff, and the rhythm of another ordinary trading day. Nothing about his arrival immediately suggested danger. He did not force his way through the entrance. He did not shout or threaten anyone. To those who glanced up from their computer screens, he appeared to be simply another former client returning to a place he already knew. Then, without warning, the illusion of normality disappeared. Gunfire shattered the routine of the trading floor. Conversations stopped instantly. The sounds of financial markets were replaced by panic, screams, and desperate attempts to escape. Employees who had been discussing stock prices only moments earlier dug beneath desks, rushed toward exits, or searched for any place that might offer protection. Some froze, unable to comprehend what was unfolding in front of them. Others instinctively tried to help coworkers who had fallen. Within minutes, lives had been changed forever. Yet the violence was not over. The gunman calmly left the building and walked toward another brokerage office nearby. There, another group of traders was immersed in the same fast-moving world of charts, quotes, and financial speculation. They had no reason to suspect that a massacre had just occurred only a short distance away. The same man entered the second office with the same unsettling composure. Moments later, another burst of gunfire echoed through the building. By the time emergency calls flooded dispatch centers across Atlanta, multiple crime scenes had already been created. Police officers rushed toward the financial district with only fragments of information. Reports described an active shooter, numerous casualties, and a suspect who had already fled one location before striking another. Confusion spread almost as quickly as fear. Witnesses struggled to explain what they had seen because everything had happened so quickly. Some remembered seeing a familiar former trader walking through the office. Others recalled hearing only a few words before the shooting began. Many could remember little beyond the overwhelming instinct to survive. As emergency responders secured the buildings and evacuated the wounded, another discovery would transform an already horrifying workplace shooting into something even darker. The investigation would soon reveal that the day's violence had not begun inside those brokerage firms. Hours earlier, before entering the financial district, the gunman had already committed murders elsewhere. The tragedy that unfolded across Atlanta was only the final chapter of a sequence of killings that had begun inside a quiet family home. That revelation forced investigators to completely reconsider what they believed they were confronting. This was no longer simply a workplace attack driven by anger at colleagues or financial losses. It had become a multi-day killing spree involving family members, former associates, and strangers who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The man responsible was Mark Orrin Barton, a 44-year-old former chemist who had once appeared to embody intelligence and professional promise. People who knew him described him as articulate, ambitious, and confident. He had attended university, worked in scientific research, and later immersed himself in the rapidly growing world of day trading. On the surface, his story resembled that of many Americans drawn to the financial optimism of the late 1990s. Yet beneath that outward image lay years of personal instability, professional setbacks, financial losses, and a pattern of blaming others whenever his life began to unravel. Investigators would later reconstruct a timeline showing that the events of July 29th were not spontaneous. They followed months of mounting financial pressure and years of personal decline. Barton had reportedly lost approximately $105,000 during the weeks leading up to the shootings. His trading account had been closed after significant losses, eliminating what he believed was his opportunity to recover financially. According to notes he left behind, he had come to believe that other people had destroyed his future, rather than accepting responsibility for increasingly risky decisions. He viewed himself as the victim of forces working against him. Those writings revealed a worldview shaped by resentment rather than reflection. Yet even those financial losses cannot fully explain what happened over the following days. Before entering the brokerage firms, Barton had already killed his wife, Leanne Barton, inside their home. The following day, he killed his two children, Matthew and Michelle. Later, investigators discovered notes in which he claimed that he loved his family and believed he was sparing them from future suffering. Those statements have since been examined as examples of the distorted thinking sometimes associated with familicide, in which offenders convince themselves that murdering loved ones is somehow an act of protection. Such reasoning does not lessen the horror of the crime. Instead, it reveals how profoundly detached from reality the offender's thinking had become. As the afternoon of July 29th continued, law enforcement agencies across Georgia launched an enormous manhunt. Officers knew the suspect was heavily armed and had already demonstrated a willingness to kill. Repeatedly, television stations interrupted regular programming with photographs of Barton, urging the public to remain alert. Highways were monitored, police patrols intensified, and investigators worked frantically to determine where he might go next. Every passing minute increased the possibility that more innocent lives could be lost. By the end of that day, 13 people, including Barton himself, would be dead, while 13 others would carry physical injuries and psychological trauma that would remain with them for years. Families would receive phone calls they never imagined possible. Children would lose parents, spouses would lose partners. Co-workers would struggle to understand why an ordinary workday had become a nightmare. And an entire community would search for answers that could never fully explain such overwhelming violence. This is not the story of a failed investment or a disastrous day in the stock market. It is not a story about the pursuit of wealth alone. It is the story of how years of personal collapse, unresolved resentment, financial ruin, and escalating violence culminated in one of the deadliest workplace massacres in Georgia's history. To understand what happened inside those brokerage offices on that July afternoon, we must begin much earlier, long before the first shot was fired, by examining the life of the man whose final trading day became one of the darkest chapters in Atlanta's history. To many people who encountered Mark Orrin Barton during the earlier years of his life, there was little to suggest that his name would one day become associated with one of Georgia's deadliest workplace massacres. He was not known as a career criminal, nor was he someone who spent years drifting through the margins of society. Instead, Barton appeared to possess many of the qualities commonly associated with success. He was intelligent, well-educated, articulate, and capable of presenting himself as a confident professional. Those who met him in casual settings often described him as polite and personable. He could carry conversations easily, explain complex ideas with confidence, and project the image of a man who believed strongly in his own abilities. Yet beneath that outward composure existed another side of his personality, one that became increasingly visible as setbacks accumulated throughout his adult life. Friends, acquaintances, and people who worked alongside him would later recall that Barton struggled to accept criticism. He disliked admitting mistakes, reacted poorly when challenged, and often viewed failures through the lens of personal injustice, rather than seeing disappointment as the result of poor decisions or unfortunate circumstances. He increasingly blamed other people for his problems. That pattern of thinking would eventually become one of the defining characteristics investigators identified while reconstructing the events leading to the murders. Mark Orrin Barton was born on April 2, 1955, and grew up in a military family. Life within such families often involved discipline, structure, and expectations of personal achievement. Although relatively little about his childhood became central to the investigation, it is known that Barton displayed considerable academic ability from an early age. Intelligence was never considered one of his shortcomings. In fact, his intellectual capacity helped him pursue higher education and eventually build a career in the sciences. Barton attended Clemson University before continuing his studies at the University of South Carolina. He specialized in chemistry, a demanding field requiring analytical thinking, technical precision, and attention to detail. Completing such studies reflected both discipline and capability, and for a time, his future appeared promising. After finishing his education, Barton entered the professional world as a chemist. It was a respectable career, one that offered stability and opportunities for advancement. Scientific research depends heavily upon accuracy, honesty, and strict adherence to professional standards. Every experiment must produce reliable data because even small inaccuracies can lead to significant consequences. Initially, Barton seemed positioned to build a successful career within this environment. However, the promise of those early years gradually gave way to professional failure. During the 1980s and into the early 1990s, Barton worked for chemical companies where his technical knowledge was valued. Yet his employment did not last. According to the information later examined by investigators, Barton became the subject of an internal investigation after allegations that he had intentionally manipulated research results to conceal problems during production. Such accusations represented a serious breach of professional ethics. Following the investigation, he lost his position. Losing one job can be devastating, but it does not necessarily end a career. Barton obtained employment elsewhere, suggesting that he still possessed skills employers considered valuable. However, history repeated itself. Once again, problems emerged. Once again, his employment ended. By the time he had been dismissed a second time, the damage extended far beyond financial hardship. His credibility within his profession had been severely weakened. The scientific career into which he had invested years of education and effort was effectively over. For many people, such a setback becomes an opportunity to reassess goals, seek additional training, or begin again in another field. Barton instead appeared to carry those failures as evidence that others had treated him unfairly. Investigators and those who later studied the case noted an increasingly consistent pattern. Throughout his adult life, whenever circumstances deteriorated, Barton rarely appeared willing to examine his own role. Responsibility was frequently redirected toward employers, colleagues, or institutions that he believed had wronged him. This tendency to externalize blame would become increasingly dangerous as future disappointments accumulated. Around the same period, Barton experienced profound upheaval in his personal life. One of the most controversial chapters involved the deaths of his first wife, Deborah Spivey Barton, and her mother, Eloise Spivey, in 1993. Both women were found dead inside their home after suffering fatal injuries. The crime immediately attracted police attention because of its violent nature and the circumstances surrounding the victims. Investigators considered Barton a primary suspect. They believed there were factors warranting close examination, including his relationship with the victims and possible financial motives. However, suspicion alone is not sufficient for criminal prosecution. Detectives were unable to gather enough physical evidence to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. No witness could directly place Barton at the crime scene during the murders, and forensic evidence failed to provide the certainty prosecutors required. As a result, Barton was never charged in connection with those killings. Legally, he remained innocent of those crimes because they were never proven in court. Even after the 1999 massacre, when investigators revisited the earlier case, the deaths of Deborah Spivey and Eloise Spivey remained unresolved. Many investigators believe Barton may have been responsible, but belief is not proof, and the case has never been judicially resolved. Following the death of his first wife, Barton received insurance money, a development that would later become one element investigators examined while reconstructing his financial history. Instead of returning to scientific work, he turned toward a dramatically different occupation. The American stock market of the 1990s appeared to offer extraordinary opportunities. Stories circulated daily about ordinary individuals earning remarkable profits through buying and selling stocks, sometimes within a single trading session. The growing popularity of personal computers and electronic trading platforms made participation easier than ever before. Barton became deeply interested in this new world. For someone with strong confidence in his own intelligence, day trading may have appeared to be the perfect environment. Success depended upon rapid analysis, decisive action, and the willingness to accept risk. Barton believed he possessed those qualities. At first, his confidence seemed justified. According to people who traded alongside him, he experienced periods of meaningful financial success. His self-assurance increased, reinforcing the belief that he had discovered a new path after the collapse of his scientific career. Yet success also appeared to magnify some of his existing personality traits. Confidence gradually evolved into certainty. Certainty became overconfidence. As profits encouraged increasingly aggressive decisions, Barton developed a stronger conviction that his judgment was superior. Such thinking can become especially dangerous in highly volatile financial markets where confidence alone cannot overcome uncertainty. Throughout these years, acquaintances continued to notice contrasting aspects of his personality. On one hand, Barton remained capable of appearing calm, friendly, and engaging. On the other, frustration often triggered anger out of proportion to the situation. He disliked being corrected. He resisted criticism. Losing arguments or admitting mistakes appeared exceptionally difficult for him. These behaviors, viewed individually, might not have seemed extraordinary. Many people struggle with pride or become defensive under pressure. What made Barton's case different was the consistency with which these reactions appeared whenever life failed to meet his expectations. Each setback reinforced a growing narrative in which he saw himself as the victim of unfair treatment rather than the author of his own decisions. By the late 1990s, the combination of professional collapse, unresolved personal controversy, and increasing emotional instability had created a fragile foundation beneath the outward appearance of an experienced trader. Few people around him could have predicted exactly what would happen next, but warning signs had accumulated over many years. Intelligence had not protected him from destructive thinking. Education had not prevented poor judgment. Professional success had proven temporary, while resentment lingered. The qualities that once suggested promise were gradually overshadowed by an inability to cope with failure. As America's financial markets entered one of the most speculative periods in modern history, Mark Barton believed he had found a second chance. Instead, the world of day trading would become the stage upon which years of disappointment, anger, and misplaced blame converged. Before long, mounting financial losses would strip away the last remaining pieces of stability in his life, setting him on a path that would end in irreversible tragedy. By the middle of the 1990s, America was experiencing a wave of economic optimism unlike anything seen in decades. The rapid growth of the internet transformed not only technology, but also the way ordinary people viewed wealth. Newspapers celebrated young entrepreneurs becoming millionaires almost overnight. Financial television channels broadcast market updates throughout the day, while newly emerging online brokerage services made buying and selling stocks accessible to people who had never before considered investing. For thousands of Americans, the stock market no longer appeared to be a place reserved for professional financiers. It had become an arena where anyone with determination, confidence, and a computer might achieve financial independence. This atmosphere gave rise to a new generation of investors known as day traders. Unlike traditional investors who purchase stocks with long-term goals in mind, day traders sought to profit from rapid price movements within a single trading session. Success depended upon speed, discipline, and the ability to make decisions under constant pressure. Every morning presented a fresh opportunity, and every afternoon brought the possibility of either substantial gains or devastating losses. It was a world fueled by volatility, where confidence could quickly become overconfidence, and where fortunes could disappear almost as rapidly as they were made. For Mark Barton, this new financial landscape represented more than a career change. It appeared to offer something even more valuable: the chance to rebuild a life that had already suffered repeated setbacks. His scientific career had collapsed after losing positions in the chemistry field. The professional identity he had spent years developing was gone. Day trading promised a fresh beginning, one that relied less on employers and more on individual judgment. To someone who believed strongly in his own intelligence, the financial markets may have seemed like the perfect place to prove himself once again. According to those familiar with his trading activities, Barton initially experienced periods of success. He was capable of making profitable trades and appeared comfortable navigating the fast-moving environment of the market. Some fellow traders reportedly referred to him by the nickname Rocket, a reflection of his bold style and willingness to make aggressive decisions. Whether earned through impressive gains or simply his energetic approach to trading, the nickname illustrated how Barton was perceived during those early years. He projected confidence, and for a time, the results seemed to support that confidence. Success, however, can be deceptive. Financial markets reward correct decisions, but offer no guarantee that those decisions can be repeated indefinitely. Temporary profits sometimes encourage traders to take larger risks, believing their previous success demonstrates exceptional skill rather than favorable circumstances. This appears to have been one of the turning points in Barton's financial journey. As his confidence grew, so did the size of his positions. He committed more money to increasingly speculative trades, exposing himself to greater potential losses. The booming technology sector, often referred to as the dot-com market, became particularly attractive. Internet companies seemed capable of producing extraordinary returns, and investors rushed to purchase shares with remarkable enthusiasm. Yet these same stocks were also among the most volatile. Prices could climb dramatically within hours before falling just as quickly. In such an environment, disciplined risk management became essential. The information available about Barton suggests that he instead embraced increasingly aggressive strategies. For a period, those risks may have produced rewards, reinforcing his belief that he understood the market. But markets do not remain predictable forever. By the summer of 1999, Barton's fortunes had changed dramatically. Within approximately 2 months before the shootings, he suffered financial losses totaling around $105,000. That figure represented far more than an unfortunate investment. According to investigators, it effectively destroyed his remaining financial stability. Losing such a substantial amount in a relatively short period left him facing enormous personal and economic pressure. The losses were compounded when his trading account at Momentum Securities was closed because of those financial setbacks. For many investors, a closed account would represent a painful consequence of unsuccessful trading. For Barton, it appears to have carried a much deeper emotional significance. The account had become intertwined with his sense of identity and his belief that day trading represented his second chance after the collapse of his scientific career. When that opportunity disappeared, he did not simply lose money. He appeared to believe that others had taken away his future. One of the most revealing aspects of the investigation came from the notes Barton left behind after the murders. In those writings, he expressed profound resentment toward people whom he believed had destroyed his life. Rather than viewing the financial losses as the outcome of risky investment decisions, he blamed others for his circumstances. This pattern reflected the same tendency investigators had observed throughout his adult life. Professional failures had been attributed to employers. Personal disappointments were viewed through the actions of others. Financial ruin became evidence in his mind that external forces had conspired against him. There is no evidence that brokerage firms or colleagues deliberately caused his losses. Instead, subsequent investigations concluded that the financial collapse resulted primarily from Barton's own trading decisions. Nevertheless, his writings demonstrated that he interpreted events very differently. The gap between objective reality and Barton's perception of reality appears to have widened. Significantly during those final months, the market became more than a place where investments succeeded or failed. It became, in his mind, the symbol of a world that had repeatedly denied him the success he believed he deserved. Friends and acquaintances also observed noticeable changes in his behavior during this period. According to accounts referenced in the investigation, Barton became increasingly preoccupied with his financial losses. He spent long hours focused on trading and frequently discussed the money he had lost. The pressure seemed to affect every aspect of his daily life. Conversations increasingly revolved around the market, disappointment, and frustration. Although many traders experienced financial stress during volatile periods, Barton's reaction appeared unusually intense. The losses were no longer simply economic setbacks. They had become deeply personal grievances. Looking back, it is tempting to view these developments as obvious warning signs, but such clarity often exists only in hindsight. Financial losses, emotional stress, and frustration are common experiences among investors. Most people endure them without resorting to violence. What distinguished Barton was not the existence of these pressures alone, but the way they interacted. With long-standing patterns already evident throughout his life. His inability to accept responsibility, his resentment toward perceived criticism, and his tendency to blame others created a psychological framework in which every setback reinforced the belief that he had been wronged. Instead of prompting reflection, adversity intensified his anger. Instead of adapting to changing circumstances, he became increasingly convinced that other people were responsible for his suffering. The investigation later suggested that this mindset continued to deepen as July 1999 approached its end. Barton no longer appeared to see realistic solutions to his financial problems. Rather than seeking a different career, rebuilding gradually, or accepting the consequences of failed investments, he became consumed by thoughts recorded in the notes he would eventually leave behind. Those writings reflected hopelessness, resentment, and a conviction that his future had already been destroyed. They also revealed an alarming willingness to transfer responsibility for his despair onto other people. In retrospect, the summer of 1999 marked the final collapse of the second life Barton had attempted to build. Chemistry had once offered him professional identity before ending in failure. Day trading became the replacement, promising independence and redemption. Yet when that second opportunity also disintegrated under the weight of mounting losses, Barton faced another devastating personal crisis. This time, however, the consequences would extend far beyond his own life. Before the stock market closed for the final time that week, the frustrations he carried for years would erupt into an act of violence that forever altered countless families. But before he entered the brokerage offices carrying firearms, another tragedy unfolded behind the closed doors of his own home, where the first victims of his final descent were not strangers or former colleagues, but the people closest to him. Long before the city of Atlanta realized that an armed man was moving between brokerage offices on the afternoon of July 29, 1999, the first chapter of the tragedy had already unfolded behind the closed doors of a quiet family home in Stockbridge, Georgia. From the outside, nothing immediately suggested that anything was wrong. The neighborhood appeared ordinary. Families continued their daily routines. Cars came and went. Life moved forward as it always had. Hidden within one house, however, an entire family had already become the first victims of a sequence of murders that investigators would only fully understand after the workplace shootings had ended. The discovery of what happened inside that home transformed the entire investigation. What initially appeared to be a workplace massacre became something even more disturbing, a multi-day killing spree that began with those closest to the offender. According to the investigation, the violence started on July 27, 1999. Inside the family residence, Mark Orrin Barton murdered his second wife, Leanne Vandiver Barton. She was 27 years old. The attack occurred inside the home, where she should have been safest. Investigators later determined that Barton used a hammer to kill her. Unlike crimes committed in sudden public confrontations, this killing took place in private, away from witnesses, allowing Barton time to control the scene afterward. Rather than immediately fleeing or reporting what had happened, he concealed the crime. Leanne's body was wrapped in a blanket, and investigators concluded that Barton made efforts to clean parts of the scene. For nearly 2 days, no one outside the house realized she had been killed. Friends, neighbors, and acquaintances had no reason to suspect that tragedy had already struck the household. While the outside world continued as normal, Barton remained inside the home, preparing for events that would become even more devastating. The following day, July 28th, the violence continued. Barton's 2 children became the next victims. Matthew David Barton was 11 years old. His younger sister, Michelle Elizabeth Barton, was 8. They were children whose lives should have been filled with school, friendships, family routines, and the ordinary hopes that accompany childhood. Instead, their lives ended inside the same home where their mother had already been murdered. According to investigators, Barton killed the children separately. This detail became particularly significant because detectives believed he acted in a manner intended to prevent one child from witnessing the other's death. While such a decision may suggest calculation, it does not lessen the cruelty of the crime. Instead, it demonstrated that the murders were deliberate rather than impulsive. After killing Matthew and Michelle, Barton placed their bodies near that of their mother. Investigators also discovered that familiar household items and food had been left nearby, creating the unsettling impression that daily life had simply stopped in the middle of an ordinary routine. The image investigators encountered inside the house remained one of the most haunting aspects of the entire case. The victims had not died during a chaotic confrontation or random act of violence. They had been killed by someone they trusted completely. The home that should have represented safety had instead become the setting for unimaginable betrayal. During the investigation, authorities recovered notes written by Barton. These writings became an important source of insight into his thinking during the final days before the workplace shootings. In the letters, Barton claimed that he loved his family. He wrote that he did not want his children to experience life without their parents. According to his own explanation, he believed that killing them spared them from a future filled with suffering. Such statements have often been examined within the broader context of familicide, a term used to describe cases in which an offender murders members of his or her own family. In some of these cases, offenders convince themselves that they are protecting loved ones from future hardship, even though the act itself is one of extreme violence and irreversible harm. Investigators and behavioral experts have repeatedly emphasized that such reasoning reflects profoundly distorted thinking. The offender frames murder as an act of compassion, but the victims are denied every possibility of choosing their own future. Barton described his actions in language suggesting concern for his family. Yet the reality remained that 3 innocent people lost their lives because of decisions they neither controlled nor consented to. His explanations cannot be understood as justification. Instead, they provide a disturbing window into how his perception of reality had become increasingly disconnected from the lives of those around him. The letters also revealed another recurring theme that had appeared throughout Barton's adult life: hopelessness. He wrote that he no longer saw any future for himself. He expressed the belief that death was preferable to continuing his life. These statements were consistent with other writings recovered during the investigation, in which he described himself as having no remaining hope. Yet even within those expressions of despair, Barton continued to frame events through his own perspective rather than that of his victims. The suffering experienced by Lee and Matthew and Michelle never appeared in his account because they were no longer able to tell their own stories. Their silence became one of the greatest tragedies of the case. Every family murder leaves unanswered questions. What were the victims doing during those final hours? What ordinary conversations took place before violence suddenly interrupted them forever? What hopes had they carried into those days without realizing they would never have another opportunity to fulfill them? In this case, the available evidence provides only limited answers, and it is important not to invent details that investigators never established. What is known is heartbreaking enough. A wife was murdered inside her own home. 2 children lost their lives the following day. Their deaths occurred before anyone outside the family understood that danger existed. As investigators later reconstructed the timeline, another disturbing realization emerged. Barton did not immediately proceed to the brokerage firms after killing his family. Instead, nearly 2 days separated the murder of Lee and from the shootings in Atlanta. This passage of time suggested that the workplace attacks were not the product of a sudden emotional explosion following the family murders. Rather, they formed part of a broader sequence that unfolded over several days. During that period, Barton had opportunities to reconsider his actions, to surrender, or to seek help. Instead, the investigation concluded that he continued moving toward an even larger act of violence. The fact that the family murders preceded the workplace shootings fundamentally changed how authorities interpreted the case. Rather than viewing the office attacks as isolated acts of revenge against former colleagues or brokerage firms, Investigators recognized a pattern of escalating violence directed first at those closest to Barton and then outward toward people he associated with his personal failures. His own writings reflected this progression. He described overwhelming despair, resentment, and the belief that no future remained. Yet those emotions, regardless of how deeply they were felt, cannot explain away responsibility for the choices that followed. Countless people experience financial ruin, professional disappointment, or emotional crisis without resorting to violence. The victims in Stockbridge bore no responsibility for Barton's losses, frustrations, or distorted beliefs. They were innocent members of his family whose lives were taken because one man decided that his despair entitled him to control their fate. By the morning of July 29th, the murders inside the house remained undiscovered. To neighbors, co-workers, and even law enforcement, nothing appeared unusual beyond the ordinary routines of another summer day. Barton dressed, gathered multiple firearms and ammunition, and left the home where the bodies of his wife and children remained hidden. He closed the door behind him and drove toward Atlanta. The violence that had begun in silence inside a family residence was about to move into crowded office buildings filled with people who had no idea that the man walking toward them had already committed 3 murders. Within hours, the entire nation would learn his name, but by then, it would already be too late for many more innocent victims. The morning of July 29, 1999, began like countless other weekdays across metropolitan Atlanta. Commuters filled the highways leading into the city, office buildings gradually came to life, and employees settled into routines they had repeated hundreds of times before. For those working in the financial industry, every trading day carried a familiar rhythm. Computers were powered on before the opening bell, financial news was reviewed, and conversations centered on market trends, price movements, and opportunities that might appear before the closing session. It was an environment driven by speed and concentration, where every minute mattered and every decision could affect thousands of dollars. No one arriving at work that morning could have imagined that before the day ended. One of Georgia's most devastating workplace massacres would forever alter the lives of dozens of families. While traders prepared for another day in the markets, Mark Orrin Barton was preparing for something entirely different. Unknown to everyone around him, he had already murdered his wife and 2 children during the previous 2 days. Their bodies remained inside the family home in Stockbridge, undiscovered by neighbors, friends, or police. Barton left that house carrying not only the weight of those crimes, but also multiple firearms and a large supply of ammunition. According to the investigation, he armed himself with a Colt .45 pistol, a Glock 17 chambered in 9mm ammunition, and additional loaded magazines that would allow him to continue firing without interruption. The weapons were not carried by accident or for self-defense. Investigators concluded that Barton deliberately prepared for a sustained attack. The ammunition he carried indicated planning rather than impulse. Every loaded magazine represented another opportunity to continue the violence once it began. As he traveled toward Atlanta, nothing about his outward appearance drew immediate suspicion. He dressed in ordinary clothing appropriate for someone visiting a business office. He did not attempt to disguise his identity. There was no elaborate effort to conceal who he was. In fact, he was returning to a place where many people already knew him. Momentum Securities had once been part of his daily life during his years as a day trader. Employees recognized him as a familiar face rather than an unknown visitor. That familiarity would become one of the reasons the attack unfolded so quickly. Barton did not need to force his way into the office or deceive security personnel. He entered as someone who had been there before. Inside Momentum Securities, the trading day continued at its usual pace. Computer monitors displayed constantly changing stock prices while traders watched for opportunities. In an extraordinarily active market, the late 1990s remained a period of remarkable enthusiasm for technology stocks, and every movement on the screen attracted immediate attention. Employees spoke with clients, reviewed financial data, and monitored developing market conditions. The office reflected the energy of the era, filled with professionals focused entirely on numbers, strategy, and investment decisions. Their attention was directed toward the markets, not toward the possibility of violence. When Barton entered the office, witnesses later recalled that he initially behaved in a calm and ordinary manner. Some employees recognized him from previous interactions. Others saw nothing unusual about a former trader returning to the brokerage. He reportedly spoke briefly with people he knew, reinforcing the impression that this was simply another routine visit. There was no dramatic confrontation, no lengthy argument, and no obvious warning that catastrophe was only seconds away. That ordinary beginning made what followed even more shocking. Without meaningful warning, Barton drew his weapon and opened fire. The first shots shattered the routine sounds of the trading floor. Conversations stopped instantly. The concentration that moments earlier had been fixed on financial markets shifted entirely toward survival. Employees struggled to comprehend what was happening. For an instant, some may have believed they had heard equipment malfunctioning or another unexpected noise common within a busy office. That confusion disappeared almost immediately as additional gunshots echoed through the room. Panic spread with extraordinary speed. Traders abandoned their workstations. Some threw themselves beneath desks in desperate attempts to avoid the bullets. Others sprinted toward exits, hoping to escape before the gunman could reach them. A number of employees searched for offices that could be locked from the inside, while others instinctively tried to help co-workers who had already fallen. The atmosphere that had been dominated by stock prices and financial conversations only moments before became one of fear, chaos, and desperate uncertainty. Witnesses later described how rapidly everything unfolded. There was little time to process events or formulate plans. Human instinct took over. Some people froze, unable to believe what they were seeing. Others reacted immediately, running towards stairwells or any available shelter. In workplace shootings, survivors often speak of how ordinary life can collapse within seconds, and Momentum Securities became another tragic example of that reality. One moment employees were evaluating investment opportunities. The next, they were simply trying to stay alive. Barton continued firing inside the office, directing gunfire toward the people around him. By the end of the attack, 4 individuals had been killed, while several others suffered injuries. Among those killed was Kevin Dial. Other employees and traders also lost their lives during the assault, while survivors would carry both physical and emotional wounds long after the shooting ended. Every victim represented far more than a statistic. They were professionals who had arrived at work expecting an ordinary day. They had families, friends, colleagues, and futures that ended without warning because one man chose to transform personal resentment into public violence. The attack unfolded so quickly that many people never had an opportunity to understand why they had become targets. Investigators later concluded that Barton harbored deep resentment connected to his financial losses and the closure of his trading account. However, many of those present inside the office had played no direct role in the circumstances he blamed for his collapse. The violence did not distinguish between individuals who may have known him well and those who simply happened to be nearby. Innocent people became victims because they occupied the same space at the wrong moment. After only a few minutes, the shooting inside Momentum Securities ended almost as abruptly as it had begun. Yet Barton did not remain inside the building. Rather than surrendering or attempting to negotiate with police, he calmly left the office while survivors struggled to assist the wounded and emergency calls flooded local dispatch centers. Employees who had escaped the gunfire emerged into hallways and outside areas in states of profound shock. Many had no clear understanding of how many people had been shot or whether the gunman remained nearby. First responders rushed toward the scene with only fragmented information, uncertain whether the violence had ended or whether additional attacks were already underway. Unknown to police, Barton had no intention of stopping. The massacre at Momentum Securities represented only the first phase of his assault. Carrying the same firearms that had just claimed multiple lives, he walked away from the office and headed toward another brokerage firm located nearby. The survivors left behind at Momentum could not have known that the man responsible for their suffering was about to create another crime, seen only minutes later. As emergency personnel began treating the wounded and securing the first building, the danger was already moving toward a second group of unsuspecting traitors. The worst moments of that afternoon were still ahead. When Mark Orrin Barton walked out of Momentum Securities on the afternoon of July 29, 1999, the first wave of panic had only just begun to spread through Atlanta's financial district. Behind him, employees were desperately calling emergency services, attempting to help the wounded, and trying to understand what had happened inside an office that only minutes earlier had been filled with the ordinary routines of another trading day. Police officers and emergency medical personnel were racing toward the first crime scene with incomplete information, unsure whether they were responding to an isolated shooting or something much larger. Barton, however, was already moving toward his next destination. The distance between Momentum Securities and All Tech Investment Group was short, allowing him to reach another office before law enforcement could fully secure the surrounding area. This brief journey would prove devastating because the people working inside the second brokerage firm had little or no warning that a gunman had just carried out a deadly attack nearby. They remained focused on the financial markets, unaware that danger was approaching with every step. Like Momentum Securities, All Tech Investment Group was part of the rapidly expanding day trading environment that had flourished during the late 1990s. The office was filled with traders, employees, and individuals whose attention remained fixed on computer screens displaying constantly changing market data. Conversations revolved around investments, stock prices, and strategies for navigating one of the most volatile periods in recent financial history. It was an atmosphere built upon concentration, speed, and confidence. Those inside had every reason to believe they were experiencing an ordinary afternoon. Barton had also been associated with All Tech Investment Group through his trading activities. He was not entering a completely unfamiliar environment. Investigators later concluded that he knew many of the people inside and was familiar with the office itself. Some investigators believed that Barton deliberately targeted individuals he associated with the financial failures that had consumed his thoughts during the preceding months. According to the evidence gathered after the shootings, Barton had become convinced that others were responsible for the collapse of his trading career and the destruction of his future. Whether those beliefs had any factual basis was another matter entirely. The investigation found no evidence that brokerage firms or their employees had conspired against him. His financial losses were attributed primarily to his own risky trading decisions. Nevertheless, the distinction between reality and Barton's perception had become increasingly blurred. In his mind, blame rested with other people rather than with his own choices. Witnesses later recalled that Barton entered the office in a calm manner, much as he had done only minutes earlier at Momentum Securities. There was no frantic behavior or visible panic. Instead, he appeared composed, a detail that many survivors later found deeply unsettling. Violence is often imagined as chaotic and uncontrolled. Yet some of the most disturbing acts occur with deliberate calmness. Barton reportedly addressed people inside the office before opening fire. According to witness accounts, he said, "I have something you'll want to see." Those words sounded ordinary enough that they may not have immediately raised alarm. In an office environment, such a statement could easily refer to financial information, market developments, or another routine business matter. Instead, it became the final normal moment before another massacre began. Almost immediately afterward, Barton drew his firearm and started shooting. Once again, the transformation from routine to terror occurred in seconds. The sounds of keyboards, telephones, and financial discussions disappeared beneath the noise of gunfire. Employees who had spent the day tracking stock prices suddenly found themselves searching desperately for safety. Some attempted to flee through exits. Others dropped to the floor or sought protection beneath desks and behind office furniture. Confusion spread rapidly because many people had no understanding of why the attack was happening or whether the shooter intended to target specific individuals or everyone in sight. Survivors later described the overwhelming speed with which events unfolded. There was little opportunity to think logically or formulate plans. Fear replaced routine almost instantly. Every decision became a matter of survival. Some people remained frozen by shock, while others acted on instinct, running towards stairwells or hiding wherever they could. Such reactions are common during sudden acts of mass violence, where ordinary individuals must make life-or-death decisions without warning or preparation. Barton continued firing throughout the office, leaving additional victims in his wake. Among those killed were Alan Charles Tenenbaum, Dean Delawala, Joseph Desert, Edward Quinn, and Scott Webb. Each represented another family, forever altered by a tragedy they could neither anticipate nor prevent. These men had come to work expecting another ordinary day in Atlanta's financial community. Instead, they became victims of a man whose anger had become completely detached from reality. Several other employees suffered injuries during the attack. Some survived gunshot wounds that required immediate medical attention, while others escaped physical injury but carried psychological trauma that would remain long after their bodies had healed. For those who witnessed co-workers collapsing beside them, the memories of those moments would continue for years. Workplace shootings often leave survivors struggling not only with grief but also with the challenge of returning to environments that once represented normal life. Offices that had symbolized professional ambition became permanent reminders of violence. During or immediately before the shooting, Barton reportedly made a remark that would become one of the most widely remembered quotations associated with the case. According to some witness accounts, he said, "I hope this doesn't ruin your trading day." The statement has frequently appeared in discussions of the massacre because of its chilling contrast between casual language and extraordinary violence. At the same time, it is important to recognize that witness recollections differed in certain respects. Not every survivor remembered hearing exactly the same words or recalled the precise moment they were spoken. Such variations are common in highly traumatic situations, where memory can be affected by fear, confusion, and the rapid pace of unfolding events. What remained consistent across accounts was the extraordinary calmness Barton displayed while carrying out the attack. By the time the shooting at Alltech Investment Group ended, the combined toll from both brokerage offices had reached 9 fatalities, with 13 additional people injured. In only 15 to 20 minutes, Barton had transformed 2 workplaces into scenes of devastating loss. Employees who had begun the afternoon focused on financial markets now found themselves surrounded by emergency responders, police officers, and colleagues desperately searching for missing friends. Across Atlanta, news of the attacks spread rapidly. Television and radio stations interrupted regular programming as reports emerged of multiple shootings involving what appeared to be the same suspect. Law enforcement agencies realized they were confronting a mobile gunman who had already demonstrated both planning and determination. Officers rushed to secure surrounding buildings while investigators worked to identify the shooter and predict where he might go next. Yet Barton had already left the second office before police could reach him. Once again, he departed the scene without attempting to hide his identity or negotiate with authorities. The attacks had been executed with alarming speed, leaving investigators to piece together what had happened from the accounts of traumatized survivors. Every passing minute increased concern that another location might soon be targeted. At that stage, law enforcement knew only part of the story. They understood that multiple shootings had occurred inside 2 brokerage firms, and that numerous people had been killed or wounded. They did not yet know that Barton had already murdered his wife and 2 children in Stockbridge. During the preceding days, that horrifying discovery still lay ahead. As officers launched one of the largest manhunts Georgia had seen in years, they searched for a heavily armed suspect whose motives remained only partially understood. The violence inside the brokerage offices had finally stopped, but the crisis itself was far from over. Somewhere beyond the financial district, Mark Orrin Barton was still free, carrying the same weapons he had used to kill 9 people only minutes earlier. Every police officer involved in the search understood the same terrifying possibility. Unless he was found quickly, there was no guarantee that the killing had reached its end. As Mark Orrin Barton left All Tech Investment Group on the afternoon of July 29, 1999, the immediate violence inside Atlanta's financial district had come to an end, but an even more dangerous phase of the crisis was just beginning. Police officers now faced a terrifying reality. An armed man had carried out coordinated shootings at 2 separate brokerage firms within a matter of minutes, killing multiple people before escaping. His identity was becoming clearer, but his location remained unknown. More importantly, investigators had no way of knowing whether he intended to continue attacking additional targets. Every passing minute created the possibility that more innocent people could become victims. Law enforcement agencies across the Atlanta metropolitan area moved quickly to organize an extensive search. Patrol officers, detectives, supervisors, and emergency response units coordinated their efforts as information continued to arrive from witnesses who had survived the shootings. Initial reports were understandably fragmented. Survivors described confusion, panic, and the rapid sequence of events, but no single witness had observed every detail. Investigators had to assemble a timeline from dozens of individual accounts while simultaneously trying to locate a suspect who remained heavily armed. The challenge was immense. Barton had demonstrated careful preparation, carrying multiple firearms and loaded magazines, and he had shown no hesitation in using them repeatedly. Officers had to assume that he remained extremely dangerous and willing to shoot again if confronted. As witness statements were compared and records examined, Barton was quickly identified as the suspected gunman. His familiarity with both Momentum Securities and All Tech Investment Group explained how he had been able to enter the offices without immediately attracting suspicion. Investigators also began reconstructing his recent history, including his substantial financial losses and the closure of his trading account. Those details offered possible insight into his motives, but they did not yet reveal the full scale of what had occurred. Television stations interrupted regular programming to broadcast Barton's photograph and identify him as the primary suspect. News bulletins urged viewers to remain alert and avoid approaching him under any circumstances. Across Georgia, people watched the unfolding reports with growing disbelief. Workplace shootings were already shocking enough, but the fact that one man had attacked 2 financial firms in succession intensified public fear. Families hurried to contact loved ones working in downtown Atlanta, hoping to confirm that they were safe. Some waited anxiously for phone calls that would never come. Inside the brokerage offices, emergency responders worked under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Medical personnel treated survivors suffering from gunshot wounds while police officers secured the crime scenes and began documenting evidence. Every office became a complex investigation involving ballistic evidence, witness interviews, and victim identification. Employees who had escaped physical injury often remained in profound emotional shock. Many struggled to describe exactly what they had witnessed because the attack had unfolded so quickly. Some remembered seeing Barton enter calmly. Others recalled hearing gunfire before they even realized what was happening. For many survivors, memory existed only as disconnected fragments shaped by fear and confusion. While investigators focused on the shootings, another team was dispatched to Barton's residence in Stockbridge. At that stage, Officers primarily intended to gather additional information about the suspect and determine whether the home contained evidence relevant to the attacks. Few could have anticipated what awaited them inside. When officers entered the residence, they discovered the bodies of Lee and Barton and the couple's 2 children, Matthew and Michelle. The discovery fundamentally transformed the investigation. What had initially appeared to be an extraordinarily serious workplace shooting was now recognized as part of a much larger series of murders spanning several days. Detectives immediately began reconstructing a new timeline. The evidence indicated that Lee had been killed on July 27th and that the 2 children had been murdered the following day. By the time Barton entered the brokerage offices on July 29th, he had already taken the lives of his own family. Investigators also recovered notes left by Barton inside the residence. Those writings described his hopelessness and included statements claiming that he loved his family, while insisting that killing them had spared them from future suffering. The letters became significant pieces of evidence because they offered insight into his state of mind during the final days before the shootings. At the same time, investigators recognized that the writings reflected only Barton's perspective. They did not diminish his responsibility or alter the fact that 3 innocent people had been murdered inside their own home. As information from the residents reached command centers coordinating the search, the urgency of the manhunt intensified even further. Officers now understood that they were searching not merely for the suspect in a workplace shooting, but for a man responsible for the deaths of his wife, his children, and 9 people inside 2 brokerage firms. The confirmed death toll continued to rise, making Barton one of the most dangerous fugitives in the country at that moment. Law enforcement agencies expanded their efforts accordingly. Highways were monitored, patrol units received updated information, and officers throughout the region remained alert for any sign of Barton's vehicle. The Federal Bureau of Investigation joined state and local authorities in supporting the search, reflecting the extraordinary scale of the case. Every reported sighting required careful evaluation because officers could not afford to overlook any credible lead. Throughout the afternoon and into the evening, Barton remained at large. Investigators could not predict where he might travel next or whether he intended to continue his attacks. The uncertainty created enormous pressure on everyone involved in the search. Police had to balance the need for rapid action with the necessity of protecting both officers and civilians from further violence. Public concern continued to grow as media coverage expanded nationwide. The story no longer centered solely on financial markets or workplace security. It had become a national tragedy involving family murder, mass shooting, and an ongoing manhunt. Then, as evening approached, the search entered its final stage. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, a police officer located Barton's vehicle at a gas station in Ackworth, Georgia. After hours of uncertainty, law enforcement had finally found the man responsible for the day's extraordinary violence. Officers approached carefully, fully aware that Barton remained armed and had already demonstrated his willingness to kill repeatedly. They attempted to take him into custody before anyone else could be harmed. Barton understood that his escape had come to an end. Surrounded by law enforcement and facing imminent arrest, he made one final decision. Before officers could apprehend him, Barton used a handgun to shoot himself inside his vehicle. He died at the scene. With his death, the immediate threat to the public ended. The manhunt that had consumed Georgia throughout the afternoon was over. But the investigation itself was only beginning. Because Barton had taken his own life, detectives would never have the opportunity to question him about his motives, confront him with evidence, or ask him to explain the contradictions found throughout his writings and actions. Much of what investigators eventually concluded would have to be reconstructed from crime scenes, witness testimony, financial records, and the letters he left behind. For the families of the victims, Barton's suicide also meant that there would be no criminal trial. No courtroom testimony could restore the lives that had been taken, But the absence of legal proceedings left many questions permanently unanswered. In less than 3 days, Mark Orrin Barton had murdered his wife, his 2 children, and 9 people inside 2 brokerage firms before ending his own life. 13 people, including Barton himself, were dead, while 13 others carried injuries that would forever remind them of that July afternoon. Yet despite the end of the violence, investigators still faced the enormous task of reconstructing exactly how those events unfolded, examining the evidence Barton left behind, and addressing one lingering mystery that had followed him for years: the unresolved deaths of his first wife, Deborah Spivey Barton, and her mother, Eloise Spivey, in 1993. Those unanswered questions would become one of the most significant remaining aspects of the investigation. When the immediate crisis ended on the night of July 29, 1999, investigators across Georgia shifted from pursuing an active gunman to reconstructing one of the most devastating chains of violence the state had ever experienced. The emergency response had saved lives, secured multiple crime scenes, and brought the manhunt to an end, but countless questions remained unanswered. Detectives now faced the enormous responsibility of piecing together events that had unfolded across several locations over 3 days. Every document, every witness statement, every firearm, every written note, and every piece of physical evidence became part of an effort to understand not only what had happened, but also why it had happened. The investigation was unusually complex because it involved several interconnected crime scenes. Detectives examined the family home in Stockbridge, where Lee and Matthew Barton, and Michelle Barton had been murdered. Separate investigative teams processed Momentum Securities and All-Tech Investment Group, documenting ballistic evidence, photographing the scenes, identifying victims, and interviewing survivors. At the same time, officers analyzed the circumstances surrounding Barton's death in Ackworth to complete the final stage of the timeline. Each location revealed another part of the story, and together they demonstrated that the killings had not been isolated acts, but a continuous sequence that stretched from July 27th through July 29th. One of the most important sources of information came from the letters Barton left behind. These writings described a man who believed he had reached the end of every possible future. He repeatedly expressed hopelessness, writing that he saw no reason to continue living and suggesting that death seemed preferable to the life he believed remained ahead of him. The notes also contained statements about his family, in which he claimed that he loved his wife and children and believed he was protecting them from future suffering by taking their lives. Investigators carefully preserved these documents because they provided insight into Barton's thinking during the final days before the massacre. At the same time, detectives understood that the letters represented only the perspective of the offender. They could explain his own beliefs, but they could not justify or excuse the murders. The evidence showed that 3 innocent family members had been killed without any opportunity to choose their own future. The writings also reinforced a pattern that investigators had already observed while reviewing Barton's life. Throughout his career and personal history, he consistently interpreted failure as something imposed upon him by others. His professional dismissals, financial collapse, and personal disappointments were repeatedly framed as the fault of employers, brokerage firms, or people he believed had treated him unfairly. Investigators found no evidence supporting the idea that others had deliberately orchestrated his downfall. Financial records indicated that his losses stemmed primarily from risky trading decisions made during one of the most volatile periods of the technology-driven stock market. Nevertheless, Barton remained convinced that responsibility belonged elsewhere. This tendency to externalize blame became one of the defining characteristics of his final writings. Another important part of the investigation involved reviewing Barton's financial history. Detectives confirmed that he had suffered losses of approximately $105,000 during the months preceding the shootings. His trading account at Momentum Securities had been closed because of those losses, eliminating what he apparently viewed as his remaining opportunity to recover financially. Investigators concluded that these setbacks contributed significantly to his growing resentment. However, they also emphasized that financial hardship alone could not explain the violence. Millions of people experience economic failure without resorting to murder. The financial collapse formed only one element within a much broader pattern of personal instability, unresolved anger, and distorted thinking. As investigators reviewed Barton's background, attention inevitably returned to an older case that had never been resolved. In 1993, 6 years before the Atlanta shootings, Barton's first wife, Deborah Spivey Barton, and her mother, Eloise Spivey, had been found murdered. At the time, Barton had become the primary suspect. Investigators believed there were reasons to examine his possible involvement, including his relationship with the victims and potential financial motives. However, despite extensive investigation, authorities had never obtained sufficient forensic evidence or witness testimony to support criminal charges. As a result, Barton had never stood trial for those killings. Following the events of July 1999, detectives revisited the earlier case with renewed interest. Many investigators believed there was a strong possibility that Barton had been responsible for those deaths as well. His later actions demonstrated a capacity for extreme violence against members of his own family, and the similarities naturally intensified suspicion. Yet investigators also recognized the importance of distinguishing suspicion from proof. Because Barton had died, no further questioning was possible, and the available evidence remained insufficient to establish legal guilt. Consequently, the 1993 murders remained unresolved in the judicial sense. Barton himself denied responsibility for those earlier killings in the notes recovered after his death. But because he never faced trial and could no longer be questioned, the truth of that case has remained one of the enduring mysteries surrounding his life. The absence of a criminal trial following the 1999 massacre created another unique aspect of the investigation. Normally, a case involving multiple murders proceeds through months or years of legal proceedings, during which evidence is presented publicly, witnesses testify, and the accused has an opportunity to respond before a verdict is reached. In this case, Barton's suicide ended any possibility of prosecution. There would be no courtroom testimony from the surviving victims, no cross-examination of investigators, and no judicial determination regarding many aspects of his motives beyond the evidence already collected. For the victims' families, this meant there would be no formal trial through which they might seek answers or witness legal accountability. Instead, the investigation itself became the final official record of what had occurred. The broader impact of the Atlanta Day Trader murders extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. At the time, the shootings ranked among the most serious workplace massacres in the United States. Businesses across the country, particularly within the financial industry, began re-evaluating workplace security. Many companies strengthened access control systems, introduced identification requirements for visitors, expanded security personnel, and developed emergency procedures designed to respond more effectively to violent threats. While no security measure can eliminate every risk, the case became an important reference point in discussions about protecting employees within professional environments. Researchers studying workplace violence and familicide also examined the case closely. Barton's history illustrated how multiple warning signs had accumulated over many years rather than appearing suddenly in the final days before the murders. Professional failure, financial collapse, persistent resentment, difficulty accepting responsibility, emotional instability, and increasingly hopeless thinking formed a pattern that became visible only when viewed in retrospect. At the same time, investigators cautioned against assuming that any single characteristic inevitably predicts future violence. Many individuals experience financial hardship or emotional distress without harming others. The tragedy resulted not from one isolated event, but from the convergence of numerous factors within one individual's increasingly distorted perception of reality. More than 2 decades later, the Atlanta day trader murders continue to be remembered not because of the financial markets in which they occurred, but because of the profound human costs they imposed. 12 innocent people lost their lives: Lee and Barton, Matthew Barton, Michelle Barton, and 9 victims inside the brokerage firms, while 13 others survived with physical injuries and emotional scars. Families were permanently altered, colleagues mourned friends who never returned home, and communities confronted the painful reality that extraordinary violence can emerge from someone who outwardly appears ordinary. Ultimately, the story of Mark Orrin Barton is not the story of a stock market crash or a failed investment strategy. It is the story of a man who repeatedly refused to confront his own failures, who allowed resentment to replace accountability, and who transformed personal despair into irreversible violence against innocent people. His actions left behind unanswered questions, enduring grief, and a lasting reminder that the true measure of a tragedy is never found in financial losses or headlines, but in the lives forever changed by choices that can never be undone. When the headlines faded and television cameras left Atlanta, the consequences of the July 1999 murders did not disappear with them. News cycles eventually moved on to other stories. Financial markets resumed their daily fluctuations, and the office buildings where the shootings occurred gradually returned to operation under new security procedures. Yet for the families who lost loved ones, for the survivors who witnessed the attacks, and for the communities forever connected to the tragedy, time did not erase what had happened. The Atlanta day trader murders became more than a historical event. They became a permanent dividing line between life before July 29th and everything that followed. Behind every number associated with the case stood an individual life interrupted without warning. Statistics are often necessary to describe crimes of this scale, but they can unintentionally reduce human beings to figures on a page. 12 innocent victims lost their lives before Mark Orrin Barton ended his own. 13 others suffered injuries. Those numbers convey the scale of the tragedy, yet they cannot express what each victim meant to parents, spouses, children, friends, co-workers, or neighbors. Every person killed had plans extending beyond that week in July. Every survivor carried memories that would remain long after physical wounds healed. The first victims were Lee and Barton, Matthew Barton, and Michelle Barton, whose lives ended inside the family home in Stockbridge. Lee was only 27 years old. Matthew was 11. Michelle was 8. They had no role in the financial collapse that consumed Mark Barton's thoughts. They were not responsible for the losses he suffered in the stock market or the professional disappointments that preceded them. Yet they became the first victims because they were the people closest to him. Their deaths remain one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case, illustrating how family members are often the least protected when violence begins inside the home. Investigators concluded that Barton claimed he was acting out of love, believing he was sparing them from future suffering. Such statements appear in some familicide cases, but they do not change the reality that the victims were denied every opportunity to determine their own future. Love cannot exist where another person's life is taken without consent. The language of protection becomes meaningless when it is accompanied by irreversible violence. Remembering Lee and Matthew and Michelle requires rejecting the narrative created by the offender and recognizing instead the lives that were stolen from them. The tragedy then expanded beyond the walls of one home and into 2 workplaces where people had gathered for entirely ordinary reasons. Employees at Momentum Securities and All-Tech Investment Group arrived expecting another day of analyzing markets, speaking with clients, and pursuing their professional goals. They were not participating in dangerous occupations. They were not entering environments where violence was anticipated. Their workplaces represented ambition, routine, and the pursuit of financial opportunity during one of the most dynamic periods in modern American markets. Within minutes, those familiar surroundings became crime scenes. The victims at the brokerage firms included Kevin Dial, Alan Charles Tenenbaum, Dean Delawala, Joseph Desert, Edward Quinn, Scott Webb, and the other men and women whose lives ended because one individual transformed personal resentment into public violence. Their families experienced losses that could never be measured simply by employment titles or financial achievements. Colleagues lost trusted coworkers. Children lost parents. Parents buried sons and daughters. Friends discovered that conversations they assumed would continue another day had unexpectedly become final. For the 13 survivors who sustained injuries, survival itself marked only the beginning of another journey. Physical recovery often proceeds more quickly than emotional healing. Many survivors of workplace shootings describe returning to offices filled with memories that can never be completely separated from the violence they witnessed. A hallway, a conference room, or the sound of a telephone can unexpectedly recall moments of terror years after the event itself. Although every survivor's experience is unique, investigations into workplace violence consistently recognize that psychological recovery can continue long after media attention has disappeared. The Atlanta day trader murders also became a significant case study in discussions of workplace security. Businesses throughout the United States, particularly within financial services, examined whether existing procedures adequately protected employees. Many organizations strengthened access controls, expanded identification requirements, reviewed visitor policies, and developed emergency response plans intended to improve preparedness. These measures reflected an uncomfortable truth. Modern workplaces, once viewed primarily as environments of collaboration and productivity, also required planning for threats that had previously seemed unimaginable. Yet the legacy of the case extends beyond security procedures. It also serves as a reminder of the importance of distinguishing explanation from excuse. Throughout the investigation, detectives carefully reconstructed Barton's financial collapse, professional setbacks, and personal frustrations. Those circumstances helped explain the background against which the murders occurred, but they never excused the decisions he made. Financial loss does not compel violence. Professional failure does not remove personal responsibility. Emotional despair does not justify taking innocent lives. Millions of people confront devastating disappointments while continuing to choose lawful and compassionate responses. Understanding contributing factors remains important because it may help identify warning signs in future cases. However, understanding must never become rationalization. Another lasting lesson emerges from the unresolved questions surrounding the deaths of Deborah Spivey, Barton, and Eloise Spivey in 1993. Barton remained the principal suspect in those earlier murders. Yet investigators never obtained sufficient evidence to bring criminal charges. And after his death, no trial could ever occur. The legal system requires proof rather than suspicion, even in cases where later events increase investigators' confidence about what may have happened. That distinction protects the integrity of justice, reminding us that conclusions must remain grounded in evidence rather than assumption. Consequently, those earlier killings remain legally unresolved, leaving surviving family members without definitive judicial answers. Looking back today, it is easy to identify warning signs that appear obvious with the benefit of hindsight. Barton's repeated inability to accept responsibility, his history of blaming others for personal failures, his professional instability, his financial collapse, and the hopelessness expressed in his final writings all seem to form a clear pattern. Yet real life rarely presents such patterns with perfect clarity while events are unfolding. Most individuals experiencing financial hardship or emotional distress never commit violent crimes. The challenge for researchers, employers, and communities is therefore not to treat ordinary adversity as evidence of inevitable danger, but to recognize combinations of escalating behaviors that warrant careful attention and appropriate intervention. Ultimately, the Atlanta day trader murders should never be remembered primarily as the story of the man who committed them. Mark Orrin Barton made choices that caused extraordinary suffering, but allowing his name to dominate the narrative risks overshadowing those whose futures were stolen. The enduring legacy belongs instead to the victims, the survivors, the families who carried unimaginable grief, and the investigators, emergency responders, and medical professionals who worked through one of Georgia's darkest days. Their experiences remind us that behind every true crime story lies a community struggling not merely to understand violence, but to rebuild after it. More than 2 decades have passed since those events unfolded across Stockbridge, Atlanta, and Ackworth, yet the questions raised by the case remain relevant. How should societies recognize warning signs without unfairly stigmatizing those in crisis? How can workplaces prepare for rare but catastrophic acts of violence? How can communities support survivors long after public attention fades? There are no simple answers. What remains certain is that 12 innocent lives ended because one man refused to confront his own failures without blaming others. Remembering them with honesty, compassion, and respect is the most meaningful conclusion that any account of this tragedy can offer. The Atlanta day trader murders remain one of the most disturbing examples of how personal resentment, distorted thinking, and escalating desperation can develop into catastrophic violence. In the aftermath of July 29, 1999, investigators, behavioral experts, and the public attempted to understand how Mark Orrin Barton, a man once viewed by many as intelligent, ambitious, and capable, became responsible for one of the deadliest workplace massacres in Georgia history. The answer was not found in a single moment or a single event. Instead, investigators reconstructed a long series of personal, professional, and financial struggles that shaped the final years of his life. Understanding that progression does not excuse what Barton did. It only helps explain the circumstances surrounding a tragedy that left 12 innocent people dead, and many others permanently affected. Throughout his life, Barton displayed characteristics that initially appeared ordinary. He was highly educated, with a background in chemistry and experience working in technical fields. People who knew him described him as intelligent and capable. He had the ability to learn complex subjects and pursue ambitious goals. In many ways, Barton appeared to represent the kind of person who could achieve stability and success. However, behind that image were patterns of behavior that became increasingly destructive over time. Investigators later noted that Barton struggled with criticism, reacted poorly to failure, and often viewed setbacks as the result of other people's actions rather than the consequences of his own decisions. This pattern became especially important when examining his professional life. Before entering the world of stock trading, Barton worked as a chemist. His career in that field eventually collapsed after conflicts with employers and allegations involving his professional conduct. According to information gathered during the investigation, Barton was accused of manipulating research data and concealing problems related to his work. These events contributed to the loss of his employment and damaged his ability to continue building a career in chemistry. Rather than viewing these setbacks as failures requiring reflection and change, Barton increasingly appeared to interpret them as evidence that others had wronged him. After leaving the scientific field, Barton searched for a new path. The rapidly expanding world of day trading offered exactly the kind of opportunity that appealed to him. During the late 1990s, financial markets, especially technology stocks, attracted enormous public attention. Many ordinary individuals believed they could achieve significant wealth by trading from personal computers. The idea of controlling one's own financial future through market decisions became increasingly popular. For Barton, day trading appeared to provide a second chance. Initially, that decision seemed successful. He earned money and developed confidence in his abilities. Other traders reportedly viewed him as a skilled and aggressive participant, and he gained a reputation for making bold decisions. This early success reinforced his belief that he could overcome previous failures through trading. However, The same confidence that helped him pursue opportunities also contributed to increasingly risky behavior. As his investments became larger, the consequences of losses became more severe. By the summer of 1999, the situation had changed dramatically. Barton lost approximately $105,000 within about 2 months. His trading account at Momentum Securities was eventually closed because of substantial losses. For many people, financial loss would represent a painful but temporary setback. For Barton, however, the losses appeared to represent something much larger. They became evidence, in his mind, that his life had been destroyed by forces outside his control. He did not view the collapse of his trading career as the result of risky decisions. Instead, he focused his anger on the people and organizations around him. This mindset became a critical part of understanding the later violence. Investigators reviewing Barton's final writings found repeated expressions of hopelessness and resentment. He described himself as having no future and portrayed death as preferable to continuing his life. Under those circumstances, yet his writings also revealed another disturbing element. He believed he had the right to determine the fate of others because of his own suffering. This belief became most apparent in the murders of his wife and children. Barton claimed that he loved them and that he was protecting them from future hardship. However, this reasoning ignored their individual identities, desires, and right to live. Instead of recognizing his family members as separate people with their own futures, he viewed them through the lens of his own despair. This distorted perception allowed him to justify an act that caused unimaginable harm. The transition from personal crisis to violence is one of the most difficult aspects of cases involving familicide and mass murder. Many people experience divorce, unemployment, financial struggles, and emotional pain without ever harming others. Therefore, these circumstances alone cannot explain Barton's actions. What investigators examined was not simply whether Barton experienced hardship, but how he responded to hardship. His response involved increasing isolation, resentment, refusal to accept responsibility, and the belief that others were responsible for his suffering. These factors created a dangerous pattern that ultimately ended in violence. The murders of Lee and Matthew and Michelle demonstrated the most extreme expression of Barton's need for control. By deciding that his family would not survive without him, he placed his own interpretation of the future above their right to choose their own lives. His actions reflected a tragic and dangerous form of self-centered reasoning in which the offender believes his personal pain outweighs the value of others' autonomy. The workplace shootings that followed represented an extension of that same thinking. Barton identified people and institutions connected to his financial losses and transformed them into symbols of his perceived failures. The victims at Momentum Securities and All Tech Investment Group were not responsible for the collapse of his life. Some may have known him professionally, while others were simply present in the offices when he arrived. Their connection to Barton was enough for him to view them as part of a narrative he had created. This was one of the most devastating aspects of the massacre. The victims were not chosen because of anything they had done, but because Barton had assigned them a role in his personal story of blame and revenge. In reviewing the case years later, experts and investigators emphasized the importance of recognizing warning signs while also avoiding oversimplification. It is easy to look backward and identify moments that appear significant. Barton's professional failures, financial losses, anger toward others, and expressions of hopelessness all seem connected after the fact. But predicting violence before it occurs remains extremely challenging. Most people experiencing similar difficulties do not become violent offenders. The goal is not to label people based on hardship, but to recognize when patterns of threatening behavior, escalating anger, and dangerous thinking emerge together. The Atlanta day trader murders also demonstrated how quickly an individual's private crisis can become a public tragedy. For days before the shootings, Barton was moving through ordinary spaces, and interacting with other people while carrying thoughts that would eventually lead to murder. Those around him could not see the full extent of what was happening inside his mind. By the time the warning signs became undeniable, the violence had already begun. Today, the case remains a powerful reminder that understanding an offender's background is not the same as excusing their actions. Mark Barton experienced failure, disappointment, and despair, but he made the decision to turn those emotions into violence against innocent people. The victims did not cause his suffering. They did not create his financial losses. They did not deserve the fate he forced upon them. The true lesson of the case is found not in Barton's justifications, but in the lives that were taken and the importance of preventing similar tragedies in the future. The Atlanta day trader murders ended on the night of July 29, 1999, when Mark Orrin Barton died inside his vehicle in Ackworth, Georgia. The immediate danger was over. There would be no further attacks, no additional victims, and no need for law enforcement officers to continue searching for an armed suspect. Yet the conclusion of the manhunt did not bring a true ending to the tragedy. For the families of the victims, the survivors, and the communities affected by the violence, the aftermath continued long after the final gunshot. The physical crime scenes could be processed, the evidence could be collected, and the investigation could be documented, but the human consequences could never be fully resolved. The case remained a painful reminder of how quickly ordinary lives can be destroyed by an individual's decision to transform personal anger into violence. In the years following the massacre, the name Mark Barton became associated with one of the most serious workplace shootings in American history. However, the significance of the case does not come from the identity of the person who committed the crimes. It comes from the people who lost their lives and the questions the tragedy forced society to confront. How could a man who appeared intelligent and successful reach a point where he believed murder was the answer to his suffering? How could warning signs that appeared over time fail to prevent the deaths of innocent people? And how can communities better recognize situations where anger and hopelessness begin turning into dangerous actions? These questions remain difficult because human behavior is complex. There is rarely a single explanation for an act of extreme violence. In Barton's case, investigators found a combination of personal failures, financial collapse, resentment, and a refusal to accept responsibility for his own decisions. His losses in the stock market were real. His professional disappointments were real. His emotional struggles were real. But none of those circumstances forced him to kill. The tragedy occurred because Barton chose to respond to his suffering by destroying the lives of others. This distinction remains essential when examining cases of mass violence. Understanding an offender's background can help explain how a crime developed, but explanation must never become justification. The victims remain the central part of this story. Liam Barton, Matthew Barton, and Michelle Barton were not participants in the financial problems that consumed Mark Barton's thoughts. They were family members who should have been protected by the person closest to them. Their deaths represented the most personal betrayal in the entire case. The idea that Barton believed he was saving them from future suffering revealed the depth of his distorted thinking. He replaced their individual hopes and choices with his own assumptions about what their lives would become. Their futures were taken away based on a decision they never had the chance to challenge. The victims inside Momentum Securities and All Tech Investment Group also represented the randomness and cruelty of the attack. They were not responsible for Barton's failures. They were coworkers, professionals, and ordinary people who happened to be present when he arrived with weapons. They entered their workplaces expecting routine conversations, financial discussions, and another normal day. Instead, they became victims of a man who had created a personal narrative in which others were responsible for his suffering. Their deaths demonstrated one of the most frightening realities of mass violence. Innocent people can become targets not because of what they have done, but simply because they are present when someone decides to act. The survivors of the shootings carried a different burden. Unlike those who died, they were forced to continue living with memories of what happened. Physical injuries could heal, but emotional consequences often remained. The sudden transition from an ordinary workday into a life-threatening attack created trauma that could not simply disappear once the crime scene was cleared. Survivors had to process fear, grief, and the reality that people they worked beside would never return. Their experiences became an important part of understanding workplace violence because survival does not mean the event is over. For many survivors, the aftermath continues privately long after public attention fades. The case also changed how many businesses viewed workplace security. Before the Atlanta shootings, many workplaces focused primarily on productivity, efficiency, and daily operations. After highly publicized incidents like this one, organizations increasingly examined the possibility of violent threats and developed additional procedures to protect employees. Access controls, visitor policies, emergency plans, and security awareness became more common considerations. The goal was not to create fear in workplaces, but to acknowledge that preparation was necessary even for events that seemed unlikely. The Atlanta day trader murders also became part of broader discussions about financial pressure and emotional crisis. The timing of the case was significant because it occurred during a period when day trading and online investing were becoming increasingly popular. Many people were drawn to the idea of achieving rapid financial success through market activity. Barton's experience demonstrated the dangers of tying personal identity and self-worth entirely to financial outcomes. When his investments failed, he did not simply lose money. He appeared to believe that he had lost his future, his value, and his purpose. This way of thinking contributed to the catastrophic decisions that followed. Another lasting aspect of the case is the unresolved question surrounding the 1993 deaths of Deborah Spivey Barton and Eloise Spivey. Barton had been considered a suspect in those murders, but authorities never obtained enough evidence to charge him. After his death in 1999, the possibility of further investigation remained limited because he could no longer be questioned or brought before a court. The case therefore remained legally unresolved. It serves as a reminder that even when investigators develop strong suspicions, the justice system requires evidence capable of proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Without that evidence, certainty may remain impossible. Looking back at the events of July 1999, the Atlanta day trader murders are not simply a story about a failed investor or a workplace shooting. They are a story about the consequences of unchecked resentment, the dangers of distorted thinking, and the devastating impact of one person's choices on countless others. Mark Barton believed that eliminating others would solve the problems he felt unable to overcome. Instead, he created suffering on a scale far greater than his own. The people he blamed were not responsible for his pain, and the people closest to him became the ones who suffered most. The most important way to remember this tragedy is to place the victims at the center of the narrative. Their lives should not be defined only by the circumstances of their deaths. They were more than names connected to a crime. They were individuals with families, relationships, dreams, and experiences that existed long before July 1999. Remembering them means recognizing the humanity that was lost. More than 2 decades later, the case continues to be studied because it raises difficult but necessary questions about violence prevention, workplace safety, and human behavior. There are no simple answers, and no single solution can prevent every tragedy. However, examining cases like this allows society to learn from the past. It encourages greater awareness of warning signs, stronger support systems, and deeper understanding of how personal crises can escalate when combined with dangerous thinking. In the end, the Atlanta day trader murders were not defined by the final actions of Mark Orrin Barton. They were defined by the lives interrupted, the families changed forever, and the enduring responsibility to remember those who were lost. The tragedy stands as a reminder that behind every statistic is a person. Behind every headline is a family. And behind every crime scene are lives that mattered long before the violence began.